Okay, hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Baumer conversation. I'm Todd Gannon. I'm the section head of architecture here at the Knowlton School, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome Galen Pardee, our 2019, 2020, and 2021 LeFevre Fellow. I'm welcoming Galen, to whatever chair you're sitting in, I guess. I hope you're comfortable there, wherever you're in New York, right? But welcome to this format. We'll see how it goes. So Galen's bona fides, and I won't list all of them here. They include a BA in politics from Brandeis, an MArch from Columbia, lots of awards, a growing list of publications about his work, and a stint in the offices of Smith Miller Hawkinson in New York, where he worked on projects, including one that's going up right now on the West Campus here at Ohio State. So if Henry and Lori are watching, hi guys, I hope you are. Galen named his design and research practice Drawing Agency and describes his work as, and I quote, focusing on the material and logistical underpinnings of architectural practice and form, and seeking to understand architecture's agency within ecosystems of political, social, environmental, and material regulations, as well as architects' ability to enact change within these environments. Now, drawing agency is a very apt and clever name. The description, built up as it is from categorical abstractions that are so popular among us academics, is, if I'm being honest here, and I plan to be honest, it's somewhat elusive, let's say. Now, this is not to say that it's wrong. It's just that one could be forgiven after reading it or having it read to them on Zoom, that they couldn't quite say exactly what Galen does. Well, here's what Galen does. Galen notices unusual stuff in the world. He asks provocative questions about that stuff. And then he makes really beautiful drawings and models that answer his own questions and outline alternatives to the often unfortunate conditions all of his noticing and questioning brings to light. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, Galen noticed that Singapore builds a lot of concrete buildings and is constantly at work making more Singapore by dumping fill into the Singapore Strait. So Galen followed up this noticing with a provocative question. Where does all the sand come from? You see, all that construction takes a lot of sand, and Singapore, being a tiny island nation, doesn't have very much of its own. So it turns out that Singapore is the world's largest importer of construction-grade sand. This tiny country is a crucial hub in an enormous, if little-known, global network of sand relocation. Business Insider puts the value of that industry at $70 billion a year. And as you might have guessed, that industry is more than a little bit shady, with much of it controlled by a black market and a network of criminal organizations, including India's sand mafia. Now, all this activity, whether legal or illegal, is reconfiguring not just the geography and hydrology of places like Singapore, which gains a lot of sand, and Vietnam, which tends to lose it. It's also reconfiguring the environmental, geopolitical, economic, and social structures across this vast network. So you might ask, how do you, Todd, know so much about sand? Well, I know this stuff because Galen made some really beautiful drawings and diagrams that lay out this whole story, and he presented them in a really fascinating job talk about a year and a half ago. He got the job. And ever since, he's been here at Knowlton, and we're very lucky that we get to keep him for another year thanks to the ongoing pandemic that has us all online. And since he's been here, he's spent his time here at Knowlton noticing stuff and asking provocative questions about the stuff that he notices and making beautiful drawings and models that help us to understand the jaw-dropping realities involved in the work we do in the world, and more importantly, to help us to imagine other ways we might configure our world and the design principles through which all of us work to shape it so that we're not so damned hard on the place. So with that, Galen, welcome. Imagine you're hearing raucous applause in that nicely appointed room you're sitting in, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Todd. That was really nice. I hope the talk lives up to it, and I can hear the raucous applause filtering in behind me as I speak. So let's see if we can get this going here. Okay. All right. Great. Well, yeah. So again, thank you, Todd. That was a great intro. I'm excited to be here for another year. Thank you as well, for bringing me here in the first place. It's been a lot of fun. I feel like I can say that, even though so much of the rest of the world has not been fun the past 6 months or so. But yeah, thank you, and thank you as well to the LeFevre committee for bringing me here and allowing me to stay. I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly, so I know so we can have some time for feedback and questions and discussion. But I want to sort of make sure to do this part somewhat slowly, so I can thank everybody. So I'd like to thank other members of the faculty, including Todd, for their constant generosity with their time, generosity with their feedback, encouragement. I'd also like to thank my fellows, Zach Cohen, Galo Canizares, and Stephanie Sang Delgado here at OSU. I was also lucky enough to be working on a sort of concurrent issue with some other fellows elsewhere. So Emily Cutel, who was the Banham Fellow over at Buffalo. I don't know if she's here, but I'd like to thank her for being a really great kind of conversation partner as we've kind of developed our research along parallel paths. And especially given the pandemic, I'd really like to thank Mike Baumberger and the members of the shop for allowing me to take over the room and, not push me to move things out there too quickly. And then, of course, my awesome student workers, Anthony Salvaggio, Melissa Folsen-Logan, Noelle Michel, Tyler Young, Sophia Kuspan, Kate Lovers, and Patrick Sardo, all of whom were invaluable as the sort of pandemic stretched things out. And then we had to kind of put everything together here at the end. Really could not have done it without you. So I'd like to start by kind of talking about where I come from as a designer and as an architect and as a writer. I think what I have come to realize over the past year is that the reason I like all these, materials, supply chains, politics, environments, the reason I like these things is because they are ways of illuminating the sort of bigger pictures that drive architecture that may actually have more to do with what we build and how we build than aesthetics or tectonics or like critical discourse about architecture, although that stuff does matter. So for instance, this ant farm project, the truck stop network, is sort of one of my favorites that I keep coming back to, which is basically a kind of found network of the American truck stop, which they then proposed augmenting with this kind of plug-in inflatable digital environment that would allow the sort of nomads of the late 1960s to kind of navigate the world, or the United States at least, with a little more comfort, but also kind of as a sort of tacit acknowledgement that there are sort of emerging infrastructures around the world constantly that create emerging communities. And one of the things that architects can do is work to identify those communities. Likewise, this group, the Detroit Geographic Expedition and Institute, was another sort of early touchstone as I began my work here at OSU. Based in Detroit, this is a kind of also from the 1970s group of geographers and cartographers who worked with disadvantaged, largely African-American communities in Detroit in the 1970s. And rather than, kind of approaching it as a sort of top-down way where the architects get brought in to sort of dictate terms or provide solutions, they actually approach it as educators and taught members of the community through Wayne State and I think also Michigan State for a while, use those platforms to teach members of the community how to analyze their own communities and put that together into a kind of format that an architect or a planner might recognize. And so this kind of became a blueprint, I think, for much of the talk, how I understand data when I say data and drawing. These are tools that expand the public's access to information about how and why their environment is the way it is, and indicate ways that architects might be able to offer expertise and assistance. So first I want to start by kind of talking about one of my very first projects called Auspicious Urbanisms, which deals with the kind of political, security, and propaganda urbanisms of Naypyidaw, Myanmar. I like the way Todd framed this as noticing things. I was watching an episode of Top Gear, as one did 5 or 6 years ago, where they actually did a road trip through Myanmar, Burma, and they had this scene of them kicking a soccer ball around on this giant roadway. And it got me thinking about why this roadway is where it is. What is this city? What is this place? And how do we kind of go beyond the kind of comedy of the TV show, right, which is about cars, it's not about cities. How do we kind of get beyond that and start to uncover the whys and the hows of this place? So I was able to secure funding to visit. And so this is a photo I took kind of overlooking the city. And as you can see, there's really not much of a city there, at least from this perspective. However, there is a sort of surplus of oversized monuments. This is a portion of the military museum. So Naypyidaw is the new capital of Myanmar. The Burmese military government built it specifically for that purpose, and they moved the government there in 2005. And again, most of the sort of public perception of this place was that kind of the image of the giant street. And I, again, wanted to get beyond that. And so what this project was trying to do is kind of figure out how a military planner could design a city based around things that were important to the military and didn't really have anything to do with architects because they couldn't hire, Zaha or Rem or Foster to do it because they were under international sanctions at the time. So the military built the whole city, and what is kind of the most striking about it is they did it by splitting everything into these very heterogeneous zones and separating them all, right? So the city is a jungle, or it's in a jungle, and so getting between these zones is actually kind of impossible other than by these huge roadways. A quick comparison here, this is Naypyidaw is on the left, Yangon, the old capital, is on the right. This is just the street grid, and so you can see how dense Yangon is. And what I learned is that the military actually started to see this not as just a kind of fact of life of the city, but actually as a kind of inherent security risk to the sort of viability of the regime. So the red highlighted area on the right-hand image represents the rough area of the city that was occupied during anti-government protests. And if you zoom in to sort of look at this thing in context compared to some of the notable spaces in Naypyidaw, you can sort of see how different, let's say, different the scale is. So in 1988, that area there in that little red kind of puzzle piece contained monasteries, contained religious sites, shrines, contained a university, contained most of the downtown business district of Yangon. And because of that kind of dense and mixed population, when the uprising happened, they were able to kind of support each other organically and spatially, right? So, monks could take in college students could take in citizens, and it really became a problem. Well, from the military standpoint, it became a problem. So what they did is kind of design the exact opposite of that and introduce these zones. And so turning now to sort of the kind of mapping study of these places, right? You start to see, this is a sort of false color satellite map, which is something I'll talk about later. The red is vegetation, blue is sort of like grass, prairie, and the yellow is kind of like a built environment, so buildings, roadways. And what you can start to see is within these zones just how much space is in them, and also what is separating them from each other. So you'll notice everything is kind of surrounded by a sea of red, so jungle. There's also, when you start getting into the parliament, which is on the right-hand side, or that military complex that I showed the photo of earlier on the left, you also see there's like a huge amount of terrain that starts to interfere with just walking around. It's also worth noting that this is a very hot environment. So, being out on a 20-lane highway with no shade is really not a very viable proposition. So again, it's this kind of security urbanism by separation, which is what I really started to kind of find interesting. And again, so this is a view of that same road where those guys were playing soccer. And if you start drawing it out in the city and sort of, again, kind of inscribing the same kind of diagramming method over top of it, you can start to see just how little there is, how this road actually doesn't function like a normal road, like High Street in Columbus or Broadway in New York City or Mass Avenue in Cambridge even. I could go on. It actually functions as a separator. This is a thing that is meant to keep people apart, and it's meant to make the city defensible. And so moving into the next project, I want to end with this. This is a sort of later study I did. A second kind of related development about Naypyidaw that makes it so interesting relative to other Burmese cities is that it has 24/7 electricity, which even the largest cities, as of my last trip there, did not. And what makes that happen is this kind of network of hydropower artificial lakes. And so this was an early attempt to use satellite data, overlay it, create a drawing machine that could redraw it, and sort of compile it all together to kind of show how these lakes grew. I mean, obviously this is early, but essentially the way it works is the sort of darkest the blue, the earliest that water is present in the image, and the lighter the blue, the later, right? So you can sort of see how these man-made lakes have kind of developed over a 12-year period. So that led me to this next project in Singapore, Territories of Territory Extraction. Again, I started to kind of, beginning by talking about this tiny little island, which is Nipa Island. It's actually an Indonesian territory. And if you look at it, what I found really fascinating about this island is this is the second version of this island that's ever existed. On the left, you can see I've tried to kind of approximate its rough boundaries as of like 1990. As you can see, by 2003, it's almost been completely eroded away. And then here it is in 2018, put back to normal. And so what has happened in that intervening roughly like 28-year period is Singapore's desire for sand has kind of created this environment where sand miners could basically strip mine the whole island to provide fill, essentially. So just to give you some context. So Singapore really relied in the early phases of its kind of sand importing regime, let's say, on Indonesia and Malaysia. Nipa Island is kind of, I don't know if you can see my mouse, probably not. Nipa Island is like just over the maritime boundary between Singapore and Indonesia. And Singapore is actually trying to grow itself by 30% by 2030, as Todd mentioned. And so you can see here, this is how the island appeared in 1991. This is how it is today. And the faint red outline shows the kind of future extents of the whole program. So I got really fascinated by this as a kind of extension of the earlier project on Naypyidaw, right, which began as this kind of question of how does politics influence the sort of sites that architects operate on before they even come in, right? Like, how do you kind of square a building against the sort of amount of logistics and material and investment that it took to actually build the ground that that building is going to sit on, which is the case in Moshe Safdie's Marina Bay Casino. And really where it ended up in is this project that's actually more about sand itself as a building material and how that supply chain actually works in the region. So this is a quick visualization I did very early on. A UN study in 2012 concluded that if you were to sort of pile up all the aggregate used by the global construction industry, it would wrap around the equator in a wall that's 27 meters wide and 27 meters tall. So this is a sort of rough approximation of what that might look like passing through downtown Singapore. And so that's sort of a big number. Breaking it down into what Singapore actually imports, some other kind of thorny issues started to emerge here. And the problem is, because Singapore imports all of its sand at this point, you would think you could kind of compare imports and export figures. The UN tracks all this stuff. You would think that would provide you a record, but it actually doesn't. Singapore reports one set of figures. All of its import partners report their own figures, and they don't match. So Malaysia, for instance, reports 1/80th the number that Singapore does in like 2007, just to give an example. And so this really started to kind of present a question for me about, like, how do you kind of draw this sort of incredible change that you know is happening and you can see it's happening, but the evidence and the data is actually not complete or biased, right? And the solution in this project, the way I've been working through it over the past year or so, is to actually use the city of Singapore itself as a drawing set and sort of mine the cityscape and its environment for data fragments that can speak to the sort of impact of sand on the cityscape. So starting from the first set, which is called Stockpile Forensics, these kind of focus on a very curious artifact of the sand trade, which are the sand strategic stockpiles in Singapore. So these are, well, they're sand dunes. They happen everywhere around the coast of Singapore, but there's also a sort of government-controlled set of stockpiles that actually happen more centrally. This is another view of that same one, and then this is a second site closer to the coast. And so the interesting thing about them is that they are both incredibly visually present, like they're taller than trees, like you can see them from highways. Yet there's very, very little government data on how much is contained inside these stockpiles, when they were started, kind of where they go, how they're opened. And so I thought this would be a sort of logical next step to sort of try out some of that satellite imaging that I've been working with in Myanmar. So these are the sort of three main stockpiles. And this was kind of my first pass. So you can use a satellite to sort of identify rough chronology, right? When does something appear in a photograph, and roughly how big it is. But you can't really, you need more. You can't really kind of figure out a volume from that. So the Graham Foundation was generous enough to help me get to Singapore. And one of the things that I did when I was there was actually use photogrammetry to extract information from photos I took of these stockpiles. So this is a kind of quick trigonometric exercise on how you might use the sort of focal length of a camera and sort of estimated distance to establish a height. And then once I had that, this is the data set. This is a sort of interpretation of that height data, which again, is approximate, but using the sort of satellite data as a sort of second set of variables, you can start to kind of create a 3D model that has a real world scale that you can start to test and verify. So again, these are fairly accurate representations, and and if you start doing some volume calculations, you might find that in Tampines, which is that first image I showed you, it's the stockpile shown here on the lower left. There's about 6.45 million cubic meters of sand in those dunes. And at Pungal, which is the kind of center top sand dune here, there's about 3.5 million cubic meters of sand. So again, I want to be very clear that I don't think the goal of this project is not to sort of trace every single grain. That's actually kind of not to me at least, it's not a sort of critical set of data. What is critical is to understand that there are these vast quantities of material moving around throughout this city, and also to illustrate how there are publicly available sources of data, visuals, photographs, satellites, Google Earth, just open government resources online that might not appear to be data. And so a lot of what I've been doing since then is kind of working to sort of identify these other data kernels, right? And kind of working them into frameworks where they're helpful. So as an example, this project became a sculpture, let's call it, in Ashley Bigham and Eric Herman's lovely exhibition here at Knowlton in the winter, Fulfilled. And so I was able to kind of manipulate the digital model I had of these sand stockpiles and break them down as actual components of nation building, right? They're the backstop. If a country doesn't sell Singapore sand anymore, they're screwed. But what they can do to kind of tide things over in the same way a central bank in the States might, decrease interest rates or sort of increase the amount of currency in circulation is they can release sand from those dune stockpiles and kind of float the construction industry until a sort of suitable trading partner or trading relationship can be established. So again, it's this kind of way of transforming these sort of inert urban artifacts into something that is actually clarifying and kind of using it as a lens to understand a sort of larger set of forces. So the next set of drawings that I want to talk about, and then we'll get into the show at Banford here. So the next set is what I like to call material cenographies, and they sort of pick up where this leaves off and kind of dig a little bit deeper into what you can do with visuals that are publicly available, publicly accessible. So trying to understand where the sand comes to Singapore from is difficult, as Todd mentioned. And one of the ways that I found to approach it was to not just try to look for ships. I mean, so you can find a ship at the sort of aggregate terminals in Singapore. If you know that ship's name, you can trace where it's gone in the region. But of course, for that, you have to get fairly lucky. What you don't need luck for is to sort of figure out what the equipment of the sand trade is. So there's a sort of standard hopper dredger that's active. There's a standard bulk carrier, a cargo vessel, and there are some fairly standard barges that are in use on these ports. And if you know where to look, they're all visible in the satellite. These are just straight out of Google Earth. You just have to know how to find them and where to look. This is actually an active reclamation site on Singapore's southern coast. And so you can see dredgers in the process of unloading their payload onto this new landmass, right, that they're forming. And so when you put those two very rudimentary data sets together and create this kind of overlay, you start to get a sense of just how much material is in motion around the entire coast of Singapore at any given time. And again, here in the same image, right? You start to see, these are huge vessels. There's a huge amount of logistics at play here. And again, it can be easy. It's actually easy to hide and much harder to kind of bring into the public spotlight. And so the last Singapore drawing exercise I want to talk about is terraform chronologies, which kind of synthesizes the two. And so this one is actually dealing specifically with that dredging that I just showed in the previous image, right? So the sort of expansion of Singapore's coastline. And so this is a project that Singapore has been undertaking since it became independent. They've been draining swamps. They've been building ports. They've been adding to their coastline. And what I've been trying to do with this data set is to create a kind of index, both of time, so what the sort of coast looked like at a given point in history, and also where the material being used to create that new land might have come from. So again, just a sort of reminder where we started on the left. This is where we are. I kind of divided up the southern and eastern coasts of Singapore into 5 rough zones. This is a look in at one of them, which is kind of, again, underway. And then I started turning towards Landsat, which is a really fascinating satellite mission that the United States has been running. It's a public resource. Anybody can download these for free. And the mission images the entire globe every roughly 16 days. So, taking this kind of taking a 30-year data set, let's say, of Singapore's transactions, you can start to create these kind of keys of certain moments in time. Once you have those keys, you can start to color code them, right? So the dark blue would be Malaysia, light green, Indonesia. You can start to color code these things and really start to create this kind of very granular understanding of how a certain territory has been shaped and reshaped over time. And then again, as you start to overlay, you begin to get a sort of relative sense, both of like the scale of the change, but also kind of the footprint geographically of where all this material has had to be transported from. And so expanding this now into the 5 sites I mentioned. So there's Tuas Megaport, which is the example I was showing over on the left side. This will be the largest cargo port in the world by the time it's completed. Jurong in the center here is is an island entirely given over to like plastics and petrochemical manufacturing. Pasir Panjang was the previous cargo terminal for Singapore. Marina Bay, the famous Marina Bay Sands, is actually built on this kind of reclaimed territory. And the airport that you fly into Singapore on usually is also itself on a sort of reclaimed peninsula. So again, I look at this as this kind of the sort of culmination of this project, right? To sort of reimagine Singapore, the city, as this kind of field of forensic data that needs to be understood because it's not complete, right? It's not encyclopedic. But if you know what you're looking for, if you know what you're trying to get, and if you start to kind of like pull these things together using just a kind of mix of architectural representation tools, forensic tools, photogrammetry, observation, you can start to create these kind of layered and sort of deeper understandings of the scale of a sort of construction endeavor like Singapore. So to finish up, this is the project that's now on view in Vanguard Gallery for a few more days here. The Great Lakes Architectural Expedition. And once again, I'd like to start by talking about something that seems unrelated, but I promise you it is. So what drew me to this region, the Great Lakes, was a kind of interesting saga of water management, and specifically how the water is managed in the Great Lakes. So a law called the Great Lakes Compact actually creates this kind of closed loop system where every drop of water that falls in the Great Lakes watershed basin has to stay there as of 2008. This ran into some issues. This is a town in Wisconsin called Waukesha, right outside of Milwaukee, that actually petitioned to change the law by basically promising that they would give, saying if they could connect to Milwaukee's water system, they would give all the water back to Lake Michigan, cleaned and treated. This created a sort of bridging county doctrine where the sort of disjuncture between that watershed line, which is actually a kind of topographic feature where a sort of very slight change in the slope of the earth dictates whether water runs towards the Mississippi River or Lake Michigan, actually doesn't align with the kind of political jurisdictions that we use to control it. So the county, the city, the water board, things like that. And so this really came to a head with this site also in Wisconsin, a little further south. And this is where Foxconn, a Taiwanese LCD manufacturer that you may or may not have heard of, they were trying to build a factory. And as it just so happens, they bought land that sort of sits exactly half in and half out of the watershed. Now, under the text of the law, in order to withdraw the 7 million gallons a day that they would need to run the factory from Lake Michigan, they would have to get all 8 US states and both Canadian territories that have signed on to the law to approve it. This could take decades. And their lawyers, being very smart people and very well paid, realized that they could essentially just call the factory public. Because while the Great Lakes Compact is very clear that you can't take water out of the Great Lakes for private purposes, you can for public purposes, and they don't tell you what those purposes are. So essentially, this factory is a public factory, even though it is, for all intents and purposes, nothing of the sort. And so this got me thinking, given that architects spend a lot of time talking about public space and the public good and all of this stuff, could we not maybe have something to contribute here? So turning from forensics of the sort of previous two projects into something that might be a little more projective about how architects might function in the future. And so this, kind of taking this sort of legal territory, right, and starting to think about it as this kind of boundary condition. So sort of unfolding the whole basin and starting to think about it as this kind of emerging material ecological territory. So the Great Lakes Architectural Expedition would sort of operate at the scale of the 5 Great Lakes and take them on as clients, essentially. So the work in the gallery deals mostly with Lake Erie specifically. A sort of interesting side note to all of this is that for a brief moment, Lake Erie was actually a legal person. The city of Toledo in 2019 passed a referendum basically saying that the citizens of Toledo had legal guardianship over the lake, meaning they could sue, as if it was like a minor, right, like a child, they could sue on behalf of the lake. That law was struck down, unfortunately, but that really got me thinking about, how do you kind of translate something like this, like a sort of collective action problem into a kind of framework that an office might deal with. So something more kind of one-to-one, where there's a client and then there's an architect, and you have to kind of figure out what the client wants and how do you provide that service. And so this is sort of, again, a kind of public architecture now. So thinking about how do you sort of map that onto something where maybe there isn't a single entity that can tell you what the public wants, and you kind of have to put it together for yourself. So the show, this is a sort of view of the gallery. So the show focuses on sort of what I would call early projects of this public entity, the Parliament for a Material World, the Maumee Basin Phosphorus CoOp, and the Last Impervious Surface in Portage County, Ohio. So we'll just go through those as quickly as possible. So starting with the Parliament. So the Parliament is actually the expedition's offices and headquarters. It's located in downtown Toledo. And so what you're looking at is actually a model of the office itself. Looking at the plan, it contains, again, kind of drawing on the Detroit initiative I mentioned in the very beginning. It's not just a design office, but it is also a kind of educational facility, both for architects and for the public at large. And the main centerpiece is this Parliament, which is a sort of legislative body where representatives of the Lake Erie sub-basins can gather as a kind of conclave and act as a entity that can speak for the lake in a lot of different ways. So again, this is another view of the model. It's a sort of open enfilade public space of various public spaces interspersed with these kind of specific nodes, right? So the classrooms, meeting rooms, the large Parliament chamber. And so basically, this entity can sort of request that projects be done on behalf of Lake Erie or respond to, developers, people who want to bring a building to the region. And so this is actually something that has a precedent. There is actually in the Netherlands and also in Minnesota, oddly enough. There are watershed representatives who are democratically elected and can act in this manner. So it's not as crazy as you might think. And so this is actually a detail model. One of the other kind of subtexts of this show that I do want to point out here is what I would say is like a willingness to engage with bias in models and in representation, and sort of a kind of larger shifting in the show of architectural representation not being so much about documenting and kind of a truth or objectivity, but actually shifting things more towards argument or taking a position and trying to prove a point. So in this case, this is a kind of very abstracted, scale-wise, a very abstracted kind of blown-up model of all the furniture that's in that large model of the Parliament building itself, arrayed vertically to kind of show the sort of process of getting a building approved. So each of these levels representing a different process, this being a kind of research phase that would have to be undertaken to kind of explain to the public, benefits, drawbacks, et cetera. So again, just to sum up, so this is really about kind of what would the projects, the next two or three projects would actually be about what these projects might be. So I want to take a brief moment. This is student work, actually. So a research studio that I led this spring called the Public Water Studio actually brought the Foxconn factory to Toledo and challenged students, in this case, this is Patrick Sardo's wastewater park project, challenged the students to actually intervene in the text of the compact and create mandatory public offsets that Foxconn would have to perform for the city of Toledo. So in this case, this is Matt Capitelli's project, which is a kind of new urban agriculture industry that Foxconn would have to support, comprising fish, flies, compost. And then Sophia Kuspan was looking at the kind of dredging of Lake Erie and the sort of ecological effects of all of that. So again, this would be a sort of example of how one way in which this kind of new client entity could start to sort of operate, right, and request new types of projects that maybe are a little outside of what we can normally do today. So two more quick projects to go through here. So the Maumee Basin Phosphorus CoOp is one of these projects. It's responding to the sort of issue of pollution in Lake Erie and the kind of conflict between the agricultural interests that surround the city of Toledo and the needs of the citizens of Toledo itself. Basically, the runoff of agricultural areas has created a sort of recurring issue in Lake Erie of harmful algal blooms. And these blooms can render the drinking water in Toledo, undrinkable for days at a time. This actually kind of prompted Toledo's personhood idea for the lake. And so this would be a kind of example of like a new sort of public-facing project. This is a exaggerated chemical topography. So taking a look at the kind of watershed basin around Toledo, and instead of showing, so it shows locations of cities and towns and the river itself accurately, but it is scaled in the z-axis to start to show sort of relative levels of phosphorus loading, which is a fertilizer component in the water stream around the city. And so the project, the CoOp itself, is actually the series of kind of new infrastructural nodes that take place along all the tributaries of the Maumee River, which you can see in the sort of top of this image. And so really they kind of act as these interceptors. So they're located on these sort of feeder streams, runoff ditches, et cetera. And the way they act is actually, it's kind of similar to an aquarium filter. So there's an acre of mesh screens in every single one of these towers that host a colony of algae. When you run polluted water over these screens, the algae feed on the fertilizer that's suspended in the water and release cleaned water back into the sort of drainage system. The other benefit of this is that algae is also a carbon sink. And, as they're photosynthesizing, they're also sequestering carbon. So it's this kind of dual purpose here, which I think is sort of interesting because, again, it would be hard to sort of find a private entity, certainly not the farmers themselves, who would be willing to sort of put in this investment. And so trying to bridge these differences between kind of private clients and the sort of greater needs on public resources. And so to finish up, I want to talk about the last impervious surface in Portage County, Ohio. And so this is a kind of project which is actually explicitly about where the beginnings of this project, the sort of misalignment between regimes of kind of material conservation and the sort of city-state structures that govern most of American political life. So this is using a kind of speculative megastructure, the Portage County Spillway, which is shown here in red, to explore these tensions. So the spillway it was created by Portage County, which is here in Northeast Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, next to Akron. And it will redirect enough rainwater towards Lake Erie to support 100,000 people per year. Obviously, this comes at the expense of everybody who lives in this county and is in the Ohio River Basin. So the expedition's role in this is to kind of try to find some sort of middle ground. So the spillway itself is this literal offset of the topography of the watershed basin. It expands it up to 500 feet into the Ohio River side of the boundary, so to the right on this screen. But because of the way drainage slopes work, it's only 5 feet tall at its highest point. So the expedition's response here was to kind of repurpose this megastructure, both monitor it and make sure that water could be sequestered elsewhere and sort of recirculated, right? So nobody's getting screwed, but also look at it as an opportunity to kind of create a public space at the scale of a county. So, turning it into something with the help of some super graphics that are more about, data collection using satellites to kind of monitor water flows and whatnot, using it as a way to kind of generate a public space in the county. So in the gallery, whoops, I'm sorry about that. Got ahead of myself. So in the gallery, again, going back to this issue of kind of truth and truth and architectural representation. This model is 1 to 500, so 1 foot equals 500 feet, but it's also been scaled non-uniformly. So the z-axis is actually multiplied by a factor of 30, just to kind of exaggerate the sort of visibility of these differences in topography. And so the idea would be that the expedition would have done this both to help themselves kind of figure out, what the situation is around this structure, but also, again, as a way of kind of making things clearer to an audience that maybe isn't architects and maybe just wants to sort of understand why things are happening around them. This is just a quick shot at one of the kind of the sort of network of public pavilions that have been put in place here. So the spillway itself is this kind of asphalt impervious surface, titular impervious surface. And then these sort of shelters are kind of scattered throughout to sort of provide a kind of a series of public spaces that are shaded. Obviously, you can use the whole expanse of the spillway. And as a side note, this another sort of drawing technique that's been used throughout this whole project is the sort of parallel projection within Rhino, which I found very useful, actually, because it is inaccurate. It's a relative form of projection where objects that are the same appear the same, even though they may not be perspectively correct. So these blue sheds are shown the same height to one another, even though in reality they are thousands of feet apart. So, just to wrap this up, so the Great Lakes Architectural Expedition is a fiction, obviously. But I do think, for me, what's important is kind of taking these sort of questions of, material stewardship, public access to communal resources, as a kind of pathway towards thinking about the future of an architectural office. And so, again, I see this, just to sum up, as a kind of movement away from documentation towards, I would say, maybe argument, opinion, and kind of shifting in parallel with what I think the discipline is going to have to do, which is sort of face the mathematical fact that we can't keep building new buildings as we have in the past, and maybe we have to shift towards preservation, public education, things that are maybe a little less ambitious as far as like producing a building, and maybe move more towards architecture as a kind of media practice, and a practice that sort of seeks to use our position and our training to communicate the sort of necessities of a changing climate, of climate change, essentially, right? And what those changes are going to mean. So I think I'll stop there. Yeah, I think, yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. So I hope you're all again imagining raucous applause, which what you'd be hearing in the Knowlton Auditorium were you here. I think that was really great. I mean, you covered a ton of ground. I don't know how long we're going to be able to hang on to our audience to kind of talk about it a little bit longer. But I think, to kick us off, I wanted to, first of all, just say, again, just fascinating research. I mean, the ability to see stuff that I think many of us might miss is to be commended. And I do see in the work there's a kind of trajectory that you sort of outlined toward the end of moving from a kind of documentary, or as you called it, a forensic way of working toward a more projective way of working. And then you end with a fairly polemical statement that, maybe architecture has to change. Maybe the discipline has to rethink its priorities. Like, are buildings the best answer? Are they the only answer? Do we need to kind of recalibrate the hierarchies of the way we organize our practices to make the world in a different way? And so maybe to start, I'd ask you to just kind of expand on that provocation at the end of the lecture.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think it started from a place of very profound depression, I have to say. As I was looking at like the Detroit geographical expedition and similar kind of community-based architectural practices that were very prominent in like the 70s and the late 60s in the States. I mean, it was very sad to realize that most of those practices don't exist anymore. And the reason is because the funding is gone. And that's what kind of made me realize that, this sort of privatization that I think we as a country have kind of, we've gone on this amazing Reaganite journey of cutting back and sort of shutting off the spigot. And now we're kind of dealing with it. I want to start to sort of question that and question, this idea that architects are only the sort of tools of clients and as a sort of extension of that kind of disappointment. Because again, I think what our history has shown is that when you pay for stuff, you get stuff. We saw that just now. They gave everybody $1,200 and things got better, not to take this in a political direction, but, I think there's a certain, I see it as a sort of like, well, if private architectural practice and the private client setup is not going to generate what is necessary from a public good standpoint, I'm not saying private practice should be banned or excised or anything like that, but rather that I think we as architects are going to have to make that argument for ourselves. And we are going to have to start thinking about what is the work that we want to do and how do we kind of take things from a kind of lip service, or not lip service, sorry, I shouldn't say that. How do we kind of take things from a sort of like a kind of waving relationship, whereas as these opportunities kind of pass you by, maybe in like an academic setting in studio, as when the client doesn't matter, how do we start to think about, well, like these things might be worth doing and maybe they don't have to make any money. And if they don't make money, somebody's going to have to foot the bill. And that is an argument that I think has not been made very much by architects. I think it's being made now with like the Green New Deal and all of these kind of reckonings that the building industry is going through around scarcity. So sand, that was kind of what really opened my eyes, right? Like sand, there isn't enough sand. It's a non-renewable resource. You can't, at a certain point, if we keep doing things the way we're going to do things, you're never going to be able to use concrete again. And that's scary. Like there's a, I don't know. So I it was kind of a joke to say it was a depressing thought, but it is kind of a depressing thought only if we can't think of a way to get around it, and I think we have to supply that.
Well, let me jump in there for a second. So I think you're right in kind of conventional conversations around school or in offices, the habit is to think of an architectural practice as a private entity, as a commercial undertaking that needs clients to do its work. I mean, there are precedents in history of public practices. I mean, I'm thinking of something like the county councils in England after World War II, where, in that country, in those decades, the late 1940s through the 1960s, the vast majority of the architects in England, or in the United Kingdom, worked for these public offices. And there was a lot of ramifications there. We don't need to get into the kind of history of brutalism as a kind of subset of that, but we certainly can see those kinds of precedents in the history of architecture. And if we zoom out a little bit to an infrastructural scale, which clearly is something you're comfortable doing, we can think of things like the Public Works Administration or the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the interstate highway system. I mean, this country within the last century has time and time again mobilized the public resources necessary to take on projects at the scale that you're talking, actually much bigger than the scale you're talking. To repurpose the Portage spillway, peanuts compared to I-71.
Right.
So there is a kind of political question in your work, which is, how do you mobilize the political will to take something like this seriously? Part of it, I think, you begin to answer in the idea of treating Lake Erie as a person, which it already had been done. I think a lot of people in this country got very flustered at the idea of corporations being treated as people, which they still get to be. Lake Erie, no more. But the idea that a kind of non-human subjectivity can be taken seriously in the political arena in such a way that one could reimagine how we organize the world at the scale that's required to not completely wreck the world, which I think is what you're looking at again and again, and why I think your project is so important. I mean, the early forensic work, I think is quite brilliant in its observations. And I'm fascinated by the more speculative work that is on show in the gallery right now, which I feel, for me, it's more comfortably within the discipline. I mean, it's easier to look at the earlier work and see it as documentary, right? And so maybe a way to turn that into a question as opposed to a lecture. You work through a series of shifts, right? You're very careful not to call material, the sand that's being moved around in Singapore, material. You call it territory, right? But at some moment in the process, material ceases to be merely material and becomes territory, which is freighted with political significance and economic repercussions. At the same time, I think throughout your work, the data you collect at some moment ceases to be merely data and becomes architecture, right? And I think we see that very clearly in the way that the sand is represented in as it was shown in the Fulfilled exhibition, right? Where the kind of data accumulation becomes a jumping off point for a formal speculation. At some point, Lake Erie as a piece of geography or hydrology becomes a kind of political subject. So I'm interested in that inflection point. And it's not unlike that inflection point where a building becomes architecture, right? That there's some kind of transformation that's very hard to pinpoint. But I think that's important to distinguish your work, say, from somebody like Edward Tufte, right? Certainly the documentary work that you're doing in the beginning has a lot of clear parallels with just like clever, innovative data representation. But I would argue that your work really does stand quite comfortably and quite confidently as architecture. And I wonder how you think about that, how you think about those moments of inflection between material and territory, between data and discipline, between building and architecture, between, all of these kind of intangible yet incredibly important transformations of the ontology of something.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question, and I think it does have to go back to the sort of, I guess it's kind of a two-step process for me. I mean, the first thing was, I remember talking to somebody after when I had just gotten the money to go to Singapore, and saying how I really wanted to not just write an article about it, but actually draw it. And that person saying, yeah, that would be great. Everything I do, I mean, this is a person who mostly writes, becomes writing. And that really kind of stuck with me as like a challenge. And so when I approached the Singapore stuff, I told myself every time I made an observation or noted something or found something out, I was going to try to draw it. And that could just be by hand, using my drawing machines, using a map. I really tried to stick to a very one-to-one relationship between, okay, there's a sort of data point over here and there's a visual consequence over here. And over time, I mean, as I kind of got deeper into it, you realize that that's sort of where this question, I think, of editorialism comes in, because I think to me, that's kind of, to get a little bit meta, I suppose, like a building, I would say, is a kind of editorial statement. I mean, that is you, the architect, that is your interpretation of a client's needs and desires filtered back through the client and the construction trades and the budget and whatever acts of God happen on site that, impact the building. And so that there's a kind of, I think for me, what it really gets down to is this kind of continuous diagramming where everything is a kind of data point. It's not maybe what, Nate Silver or a statistician would call, it's maybe not the strongest data point, but it's all data and it's all there. And it's all, again, once you sort of set yourself out there to sort of look for answers or partial answers or some kind of information, it's all there and it's all marshallable, to get you a little bit further towards understanding something. And so I guess that's kind of how I think about it.
Well, let me push back just a tiny bit, because it seems like you're falling a little closer to the representational, almost didactic side of the work that you're doing, right? That you feel a very serious responsibility to make information legible and accessible, right? Particularly information that we might not have such easy access to, or might not be so visible when we're just walking around. Right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And so here's where it gets kind of interesting for me, and this is where the disciplinary question becomes pressing as well. If I look at the work that was shown in the Fulfilled gallery, which is a representation of sand, to me it seems more architectural and also less legible as a representation of the volume of sand moving around through these networks. When I look at some of the projects in the Vanguard Gallery right now, similarly, the legibility of the projects is less indexical and it's more intuitive, right? So when I look at the Parliament, I have all kinds of questions, and I want to ask a couple of them about the architecture of that object. I wonder about the monumentality of the kind of bars that compose the Phosphorus CoOp, which immediately had me thinking about people like P.V. Aureli or Vittorio Rigotti and a kind of Italian Marxist monumentality, you might say. And so I wonder about those things, but again, there does seem to be a strange condition where the more architectural the projects seem to become, the less legible the data that constructs them.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it is interesting. And it's something I think that took a lot of kind of mental, not gymnastics, but it definitely was a big jump. I mean, I think, I went into this kind of saying like, yes, this would be like the Ohio project was going to be, not only a chance to bring things closer to back to the United States, but also a way to sort of, start to make that bridge between a sort of building project and a project about buildings. And I guess it's the sort of, I guess for me, what kind of helps it is a sense of storytelling. I mean, I think that's also the case with Aurelie and Dogma, and I think a lot of the sort of Spanish practices today that are doing kind of a mix of built, but also speculative kind of exhibition built work too. And obviously I'm not putting myself on either of those levels just yet. But I do think it's the story for me that I think is maybe kind of the key, if that's kind of getting to it. Like, I think there's a real value in treating the sort of stories we tell ourselves about architecture as something that can be taken seriously, but also, just as the sort of forensic project, every data point needed a drawing. Maybe it's something like every story beat needs a good building to jam itself into.
I think that's fair. I also think that buildings and graphic data tell stories in different ways, right? And you happen to be someone who's quite skilled on both sides of that equation. You can make very compelling data representations, and you also make very compelling architecture. But I think they tell stories in different ways. So I would imagine if a project like some of the speculations of the Great Lakes Architectural Expedition were to happen, their monumentality would speak to the scale and to the collective will required to produce something like that. The importance of taking seriously something as life-giving as the Great Lakes Basin, right? 20% of the fresh water on the planet is in the Great Lakes. So this is like not something to be taken lightly. And so, you seem to be hinting at, although you don't come out and address it directly, that there is in fact an architectural expression, or architecture has a role in making the stakes of these kinds of issues apparent without having to say it's this many gallons of water per day, or it's this long of an impervious surface. All that data is important, but I think that when architecture speaks very well, it communicates somewhat more intuitively, or communicates somewhat more emotionally, right? Or in the way that we interact with it, right? And so I'll give you an example. Earlier today, I was looking through some of the projects, and my daughter came into my office because, COVID, she's home. She's 7. And I asked her, we were looking at the Parliament. I said, well, what do you think about that thing? And she said, boy, it has a lot of square rooms, and I can't quite figure out where the door is. And I realized that she was asking kind of standard jury question, where's the door? But it's also an important question in the context of that building. If you're designing for a collectivity that expands beyond human beings, the question of where the door is, the question of access more broadly, which clearly has something to do with the manifold aspects of the plan and the sort of monumental openness that you seem to be pursuing. But I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. I mean, how do you begin to conceive of an architectural expression that moves past the specifics of the data toward a kind of aesthetics that is that matches or complements the seriousness of the politics?
I love that question. That's great. I think so. I mean, speaking specifically to the work in Banvard, I mean, in that case, it was I got really fascinated by the sort of, in a sense, it's actually kind of the inverse, really, of what you're saying. It's a big issue, the sort of the question of the 20 million gallons of water, right? But what controls it is actually this very, very slight change in the topography, and the drainage slope of a roof is also something that can be very, very imperceptible. And I think a lot of that, so just to kind of, maybe just sort of answer it as a kind of example, right, through what I did, I think a lot of that actually came from a kind of frustration with how do you make a building that would be this sort of representation of a kind of the importance of water, for example, right? And how do you kind of show that to somebody who isn't an architect? I mean, it almost got back into ornament, and maybe we can get into that, but that's a little, it's a little dodgy. But, you know, I think that, I think that's kind of where I really found a lot of the sort of purchase of those projects as architecture was in kind of not not necessarily like a precise dimension, but in a sort of appropriate dimension, and using the sort of internal logic of maybe, let's say, like the forensic aspects of those projects, and the sort of like storytelling aspect of those projects to create a kind of specificity. So, you know, the doors in the Parliament complex are a great example of that. I actually found this really amazing, and I can't take credit for it. Somebody else has already published a thing about it, but, you know, when they were trying to end the Vietnam War, there was a whole like month-long process of trying to design a proper table that the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, the US, and the Russians could all sit at, and neither of them would feel slighted or aggrieved or aggressive.
The French were there too.
Right, right.
And they came up with a circle.
Yeah, it was like a circle, but it was like a circle that was like split in half, and then there were like two side tables. It's this really weird, it's a really strange thing. And I think that actually kind of encouraged me in a way. I mean, obviously, you know, again, Vietnam War is not an encouraging thing at all, but the idea that these things do matter to people, and that there is a kind of role that design and objects play in how you might approach a situation. So, you know, the way that you know, it was sort of important in the sort of Parliament chamber to put the speaking position in the center of the room and not do it like Westminster style, where there's two sides yelling at each other, but actually kind of enclose it in a more circular, I mean, I don't know, you know, this might all be bullshit, but like it's, you know, it's enclosed in a sort of circular manner, right? It's kind of this egalitarian approach. The conference tables are circular, whereas, you know, the sort of workbenches are more, are oversized, they're extra long, so that it's kind of about collaboration and a sort of anti-individualism. So, you know, I think it's, I don't know if that totally answers the question, but I think it's in there, the sort of like translation.
I think it's heading in that direction. You know, I mean, this is work that is new. I mean, I think these are problems that you're working on, obviously. I don't think you've entirely worked them out yet, and I wouldn't expect you to at this point. I mean, I think that's something that actually needs to be worked out beyond the individual architect, I think. I mean, to develop a language that really does have that kind of impact is a generational project, I think. And the kind of collectivity that is at the center of your speculations, I think, is how we get there. So I just wanted to put those kinds of questions on the table. I see that now the gallery is becoming a little more peppy. So I want to draw in a couple of questions from beyond. We'll start with a more technical one from Nun Kung Bik from the architecture program. Galen, as a person from Myanmar, it was very enlightening to hear about the weird urbanism of Naypyidaw. Question: can you clarify the difference between beach sand and building sand? Yeah, I think that difference is important.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, I would actually, I'll push back just a little bit. I mean, it is weird, but again, the point is, it's weird implies randomness. I think the thing there is that you can start to put some kind of like a steering wheel on the randomness and get it towards interesting. But anyway, so beach sand and sort of what I would say is marine sand is actually only really usable for fill projects like those dredging projects, because it has salt in it. You would have to, if you were to use that for concrete, you'd have to rinse it. It's very, I mean, again, this is like such a common material that these little things like filtering things or moving things around, they actually do add a lot of cost in a sort of proportional sense. So, you know, rinsing the sand actually kind of ruins the economics of it. So beach sand that's picked up off the ocean floor, that goes straight into terraforming land reclamation projects. Sand that comes from riverbeds, lake beds, actually a lot of the kind of open pit mining in Wisconsin, which has frac sand, which is a super fascinating story of how plate glass manufacturers and oil producers were fighting over sand until very recently. That's all coming from dried up lake beds. So the important thing for cohesion is water. But obviously, if you're putting it into concrete, it needs to be as unsalted as possible. Whereas if you're just dumping it into a caisson or putting it onto a beachhead someplace, it can be salt.
All right, and actually, there's another issue about the geometry of the sand grains as well, right? That
yes,
for
yes.
concrete, river sand works because it remains angular, but like desert sand or sea sand is more eroded, and it doesn't bond as well in the curing process.
Right. That's why most of the concrete in Dubai is actually made from sand they imported from Australia. Like they can't use their desert sand to build those skyscrapers.
So great. Let's move on to another question. This one from Caitlin Baker. It's inevitable that climate change is devastating resources and bringing about a scarcity of materials like sand. How do you, hypothetically, see drawing agency embracing this scarcity?
Well, I think the main purpose would be, again, it's not so much that architects don't know about climate change. I think we do. I think there's sort of two prongs here. I think it's both a project that is speaking to us architects within the profession and saying, hey, wait a minute, like, you know, the contractor's not going to tell you this, but we're running out of sand. You should maybe try to invest in timber or alternative building practices. But again, in the other part of it is to sort of explain it to the public. I mean, again, for the time being, we're operating in a system where, you know, the architect can't just unilaterally say, no, we're not doing this. You know, in a lot of cases, the client needs to know. Maybe the building department in your city needs to know. So it's a kind of dual system or rather it's like a dual audience, right? And it's for us, but it's also for the people who hire us and the people who, again, lay the groundwork for all the work that we do.
Awesome, thanks. Thank you for that. One more question from the gallery. This is from Kimberly Ware. Can you speak about how this work intersects with landscape architecture? And I'm just going to add in there planning, which I think also has a significant role to play here. And how specifically you position the discipline of architecture at that scale? Yeah,
well, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, somebody else out in the world has been saying for a while, and Fred Sharman, actually, that's his name. Fred Sharman, he's at Morgan State, just did a nice book on space stations and space architecture. But this is cribbing from him, but he's been saying for a long time that architecture is going to become more and more about interiors. And the sort of landscape aspect of a site or a project is going to become, well, more landscape. It's going to be less maybe about, you know, landscaping around a particular building and more about the kind of sustainability issues that I think a lot of people at Knowlton, the landscape department, are looking at. So it's going to, I think what's going to be interesting to me, and this is where the planners come in, is I think there is going to be this kind of shift about, you know, this sort of sequence of how a project gets started. I think if anything, this summer has raised again just how many blinders there are around the kind of profession of architecture and planning and landscape. I mean, and this is racial. This is about you know, who finances what. I mean, there's just so many different things that are going to have to be like kind of torn apart here. But again, I think it's really going to have to come down to those three disciplines actually working more closely, but also maybe even slightly more separately than they have in the past, where architecture is really more kind of turning in on like the kind of inside of a project. The landscape is sort of looking at it at the scale of a landscape, at the scale of a watershed, at the scale of whatever it happens to be. And the planners are there to sort of think about the kind of social, you know, the bigger social picture and how those things kind of play out, you know, up and down these scales of interfaces, something like that. But I'm not a planner or a landscape architect, so.
Well, I think you're right. I think that we are at a time on this planet that business as usual in any of our disciplines is not enough to get the job done. And I think what, you know, the kind of dramatic rethinking that you're proposing, you know, can we reimagine what a public architectural office is? Can we reimagine what a client is? Can we wrap our heads around the idea of working for the planet as opposed to working for those with the economic means to bring an architect to the table. And I think those are really important questions. And to do those with any kind of seriousness, we're going to need to be able to marshal all of the disciplines that are involved in shaping the planet. And I think that your work is really important because of its novel engagement of those things. The only quibble I would have with your response to that is that, I hope we're not giving up too quickly on the outside. I think there is a place, as your work demonstrates, I think there is a place for the expression that is available through building. So even I think you're right that we need to be thinking about a way to imagine the world that is less reliant on building new buildings all the time for obvious environmental reasons. But I think that there will remain a place for building. And I think, I hope that the design of buildings continues to happen through the kind of intelligence and originality of designers like yourself. So the outsides you make are too good for me to write them off. So I don't want you to. But I see your word, and we're running a little bit long. I think this is maybe a great time to cut it off. But this has been really a really enlightening conversation. I look forward very much to more work. I can't wait to see what you get up to this year, and we'll see you very soon in person, I hope. So everyone else, thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Thank you.